Stop being a coward, Janet. This space is already ventilated. At 5:42 on turnaround morning, Trent Halverson said it with his finger jabbing the steel hatch of digester vessel 4, as if force of personality could rewrite gas chemistry. 90 minutes later, one contractor would leave the site by helicopter, and the solvent recovery unit would begin a 6-week outage that tore a clean line through the quarter's profit. But at 5:42, all anyone could hear was rain ticking against pipe racks, forklifts beeping in reverse, and a supervisor with a schedule board in his hand trying to shame a specialist into crossing a red boundary. Janet Dawson stood in oil-dark concrete beside the vessel skirt, hard hat lamp catching white paint marker around the manway. N2 blanketed/entry by permit only. She had 14 years in pulp chemical maintenance, most of it spent in spaces where oxygen disappeared without warning and vapor stratified in layers that looked harmless from a ladder. Her pay sat at $112,000 because she carried certifications most people treated as paperwork until the minute alarms screamed. Atmospheric stratification, isolation boundaries, rescue triggers. She knew which valves lied by position, which tags got swapped, which quick checks ended in body retrievals. She didn't project authority by volume. She projected it by numbers no one could argue with. The vessel itself was a blunt, vertical cylinder with a domed top 40 feet high, lined for hot chemical digestion, now down for turnaround cleaning and baffle repair. Overnight, operations had nitrogen blanketed it to suppress oxidation during cooldown. Nitrogen blanket meant oxygen displacement by design. Oxygen displacement meant entry was forbidden until forced air dilution achieved safe concentration and stable readings at top, middle, and bottom. No shortcuts existed in that chain. Permit signed, isolation verified, 4-gas monitor bump tested, continuous sampling, rescue team staged. Crossing the plane of the manway without those controls was not bravery, not hustle, not leadership. It was a mathematically predictable asphyxiation event waiting for witnesses. Janet unclipped her 4-gas meter, checked the date sticker from calibration, and clipped the sampling line to the hatch lip. The display came alive in green segments, then flattened into warning color so abruptly it looked like a slap. O2 read 3.0%. LEL sat low, but moving. VOC channel climbed, dipped, then climbed again in ragged pulses. Hydrogen sulfide remained near zero, carbon monoxide negligible, but oxygen at 3.0 erased every other conversation. She held the probe at hatch level another 10 seconds, then lowered the line 6 inches and watched the oxygen number twitch to 2.8 before returning to 3.0. Her monitor's audible alarm gave short, hard beeps, the kind that made old operators go quiet. Trent didn't go quiet. "You're proving my point," he said. "You clip a gadget on a hatch and act like the plant stops because your screen says red." Janet looked at the monitor. Then she looked at Trent. "At 3% oxygen, you do not have atmosphere. You have an asphyxiation chamber. No permit, no entrant." He gave a laugh too sharp to be humor. "Obsolete, that's what this is. Obsolete thinking. We ran ducting before shift. The space is fine." "Ventilation has a calculated flow and a measured result," she said. "You are quoting effort, not outcome." Around them, the morning crew slowed without appearing to slow. A rigger coiled chain too carefully. A scaffold hand stopped halfway through tightening a toe-board bolt and kept his wrench on it. Everyone had learned the same social rule. Never stare at a supervisor conflict. Always stay close enough to hear the verdict. Overhead, sodium lights hummed against gray dawn. Steam drifted from a nearby condensate header and flattened against the vessel shell. The digester's manway cover hung open on its chain, thick gasket dark with old residue. The opening looked ordinary, and ordinary openings killed people faster than obvious hazards ever did. By the second week of October, turnaround pressure had hardened into a daily production countdown, and Trent carried it like a permanent injury. His clipboard was layered with revised milestones, red circles around missed tasks, and a bonus threshold everyone knew he was chasing. He stepped closer to Janet until his safety glasses nearly touched her face shield. "Do you understand who is behind on this unit?" "Me." "Do you understand who signs your overtime?" "Me." "You're being lazy at the worst possible time?" She kept her voice at normal volume. "Lazy is skipping measurements. This is confined space entry under oxygen deficiency. Procedure applies." "Procedure applies when there's a real hazard," he snapped, "not when someone wants to hide in policy." She had heard versions of that line for 14 years. Policy, paper, bureaucracy, excuses from people who wanted physics to wait while they made a deadline. Her pulse jumped once, then settled into the focus she trusted. She rechecked her monitor by habit, not doubt. O2 held at 3.0. VOC surged again, then dropped. Stratified pockets. Likely residual solvent off internal films. Not yet mixed out. She pointed to the display so the nearest two operators could see. "This is not a paperwork issue. Air is 20.9% oxygen. Entry minimum is 19.5. We are at 3. Trent glanced at the screen and dismissed it with a wave. "Your gadget is reading the dead pocket near the lip. We'll stir it. It is reading what an entrant would breathe if he leaned into this opening right now." "You always do this," he said. "Every turnaround, same speech, same delay." "Every turnaround, same chemistry," she replied. The words landed in the cold space between them and held there. Trent's jaw tightened. He shifted from argument to hierarchy, the move she had expected from his first sentence. "I am giving you a direct instruction to prep entry. Harness, retrieval line, and first man in 10 minutes. "No." A forklift rolled past behind him, carrying palletized refractory brick, diesel engine rattling over patched concrete. The driver looked straight ahead with the practiced stare of someone who wanted no part of this. Trent blinked once, as if he had misheard. "What did you say?" "I said no. You do not have a permit-ready atmosphere." He spoke through his teeth. "Coward?" She didn't answer. "Lazy?" She didn't answer that either. "Obsolete?" That one scraped harder. Not because it was clever, but because she had spent years watching managers use that word on anyone who refused to convert a hazard into a statistic. Obsolete meant expensive. Obsolete meant inconvenient. Obsolete meant the people who remembered prior incidents and would not pretend those names had vanished. Janet felt the insult in her shoulders, in the urge to fire back, in the old reflex to prove toughness by staying in the argument. She let the reflex pass. In confined space work, emotional reactions caused sequencing errors, and sequencing errors stacked into rescue calls. She keyed her radio with her left hand, eyes still on Trent. "Control, this is Dawson at DV4 Manway. Stop work on confined entry. Repeat, stop work. Atmospheric reading. O2 3.0 at hatch. Unstable VOC trend. Permit conditions not met." Static hissed. Then the board operator came back, cautious and formal. Copy, Dawson. Stop work on confined entry at DV4 pending verification. Trent's face went still in a way that signaled danger more than shouting. You just made this official over a handheld monitor. I made it official over measured oxygen deficiency. He held up his clipboard like evidence in court. I'm documenting insubordination delay. Document measured values, too, she said. Include timestamp. For a moment, only equipment noise filled the deck. A distant compressor starting, chain links tapping steel, a pressure relief flutter from another train. Janet could smell wet insulation, machine oil, and faint solvent sweetening the damp air near the vessel. The kind of odor that sat low and then moved when weather pressure shifted. She noted it without dramatizing it. Distinctive details mattered later, especially when memory and liability began fighting each other. Trent took one step back and pointed at the open hatch again, slower this time, as if instructing a child. Listen carefully. This unit goes back today. Corporate will not accept another slip. We already ventilated. We already posted the board. We are entering that vessel. Janet answered with the same sentence she would later repeat under oath, because it contained the full mechanism and no decoration. Authority can set a schedule. Authority cannot set oxygen concentration. A few heads turned away at that, not out of disrespect, but because everyone on that deck understood the line she had crossed. Public refusal changed the script. Up to that moment, this was a disagreement that could have died in a side conversation and a retest. After that sentence, it became a record. Trent stared at her for 3 seconds, then gave a clipped smile that held no warmth. If you won't do the job, I'll find someone who will. He pivoted toward the scaffold crew and called for Luis Ortega by name. Janet watched the younger mechanic climb down, gloves tucked in his belt, confusion already tightening his expression as he approached the exclusion tape. She did not move from the hatch. She did not lower the monitor. The red alarm bar remained steady in her palm, indifferent to rank, indifferent to payroll, indifferent to anyone's opinion about who was brave enough to ignore it. Louise stopped at the tape and looked from Trent to Janet to the open manway, trying to map chain of command against the sound of a monitor alarm that refused to quiet down. He was 26, good hands on scaffold and pump rebuilds, still new enough to believe most conflicts had a sensible middle. Trent pointed at the vessel and said, "You're on entry prep. Harness up." Janet turned the monitor so Luis could see the display and answered first. "Read that number out loud." Luis swallowed. "Oxygen 3.0. His face lost color under the sodium lights. She did not move from the hatch. She clipped a weighted sample tip to 30 feet of tubing, checked the pump draw rate, and spoke in the tone she used for lockout verification, clear enough for every ear on the deck. Top, middle, bottom. We're doing a full profile now with witnesses. Trent made a disgusted sound behind her, but she was already lowering the line through the manway by marked tape intervals. At 4 feet below the lip, oxygen jumped to 6.9, then drifted back to 5.8. VOC rose in short teeth, and LEL flickered between 1 and 4%. At 12 feet, oxygen dropped to 4.2. At 22 feet, 2.9. The pattern was textbook stratification. Disturbed upper layer, dead lower zone, solvent vapor pockets moving on weak currents. Janet called each number while Meena Patel, assigned as attendant, wrote them on the back of a permit carbon copy. Top range unstable, mid 4.2, lower range 2.9, VOC climbing, LEL unstable. She tapped the edge of the manway and looked at Luis, not Trent. If you kneel to work a lower baffle in this atmosphere, you black out before you can stand up. That is the mechanism. There is no warning breath. Luis nodded once, slow. He had heard training versions in classrooms with clean slides and coffee. Hearing it beside a live hatch with rain on steel made it a different language. A fixed gas beacon mounted on the vessel skirt changed from amber standby to red pulse and chirped twice, then reset. Janet tracked it with her eyes and walked over without lowering situational awareness at the opening. The detector head was tagged VOC-D4A, last calibration sticker 22 days old, still valid. She watched the diagnostic screen cycle, 0.0, 0.3, 1.1, then 0.2% LEL. Intermittent vapor release, not sensor fault. She opened the weather shield and checked for condensation bridging the terminals. Dry. She reseated the connector anyway, confirmed steady power, and documented the pulse in her pocket notebook with time to the minute. Distinctive details either became evidence or disappeared under opinion. She did not let details disappear. At 5:47, the rain thickened and blew sideways through the pipe rack, and the temporary ventilation duct shuddered like a loose sleeve against the vessel nozzle. Janet followed the duct path with her lamp. The blower sat on a skid 10 feet away, electric motor humming. But the 12-inch flex line had two hard kinks where it crossed a grating edge, and one section near the coupling had a tier wrapped with silver tape that breathed in and out with each pulse. Intake air looked active from a distance. Delivery at the discharge was another story. She pulled a vein anemometer from her bag, held it at the duct end inside the manway plane, and took 3 readings: 620, 640, 615 cubic feet per minute equivalent. She spoke without raising volume. Required purge for this vessel after nitrogen blanket is minimum 2,000 cubic feet per minute sustained with mixing. We have roughly 600 in a leaking duct. Trent said, "Air is air. It's moving." Janet shook her head. Flow without turnover is theater. This volume is about 9,000 cubic feet with internals. At your current rate and poor distribution, you're not clearing pockets. You're feeding a gradient. She pointed with 2 fingers into the dark interior. Baffles split this shell into compartments. Dead zones hold whatever you don't measure. Mina wrote that down too. Hand unsteady but accurate. She crouched near the lower blind flange on the nitrogen blanketing line and put a gloved hand against the pipe. Cold. Too cold for a line, supposedly isolated and bled for entry prep. She leaned closer and heard a faint needle hiss under plant noise, a sound like soda opening far away. The spectacle blind tag read, "Installed," but the upstream hand valve stem sat a quarter turn off, hard close. No one could guarantee whether that position was passing without testing. She sprayed leak detector at the packing gland and watched tiny bubbles form and hold. "Blanket source may be bleeding through," she said. "Not full flow, enough to suppress oxygen recovery. This must be locked and verified at 0 pressure before any permit discussion." Trent snapped, "That valve has been like that for years." Janet answered, "Then it has been wrong for years." Luis shifted his boots on wet concrete and asked quietly, "Can we just run blower longer?" The question was honest, the kind that kept people alive if answered right. Janet met his eyes. "Longer helps only if the system can actually mix the full volume and the source is isolated. Right now, we have poor airflow, possible nitrogen leak-in, and solvent residue off-gassing. If we add random corrections, we can create a different hazard faster than we remove this one. She held up the meter so he could see VOC oscillation in real time, the bars climbing and dropping in uneven waves. Those spikes are telling you the atmosphere is layered and moving. You don't enter moving layers blind. She took a telescoping mirror and high-lumen flashlight, angled them through the manway, and scanned the first interior baffle support, where the work order called for grinding and patch weld. Corrosion scale glinted wetly. More important, the support tab at 11 o'clock showed a hairline crack along the toe of an old weld, dark line running half the tab width. That crack mattered for two reasons at once: mechanical instability during grinding and crevice area retaining solvent residue. She narrated as she observed. Cracked support weld on upper baffle tab. Corrosion undercut. Work scope confirmed. Spark work here without atmosphere control is disallowed. Mina wrote crack location. Luis leaned forward, stopped himself at the tape, then stepped back. The monitor in Janet's hand gave a sharp, escalating tone and flashed high-voc briefly before settling. She reset alarm acknowledgement and did not silence it fully. Transient spike to 180 parts per million equivalent, she said. Not enough to trigger immediate evacuation on open deck. But inside enclosed volume, with oxygen manipulation, it changes burn behavior. Trent laughed once. Brittle. Now we're scared of parts per million. Janet replied. We are respectful of fuel plus oxidizer plus ignition. That equation is older than this plant. She pointed toward a cart parked by the scaffold stairs, where an oxygen cylinder manifold sat chained upright, green caps off, regulators already attached. Why are those bottles staged at a confined space hatch? No one answered for a beat. Then a pipe fitter near the cart said, We were told to keep them ready in case readings stayed low. Janet walked to the cart and checked the regulator threads and hose condition. One hose had a nick at the ferrule with white frost marks from prior rapid expansion. Oxygen service hoses could not be treated like compressed air utility lines. Contamination plus high-pressure oxygen turned small mistakes into ignition sources. She closed both regulator handles fully, spun protective caps onto the hose ends, and hung a red tag through the cart frame. Oxygen injection prohibited for atmosphere correction. She read it aloud for witness. This is not a breathable air setup. This is oxidizer supply. It does not belong in purge correction. At 5:51, control radioed for status. Janet keyed up while keeping eyes on the manway and the nitrogen line. DV4 atmosphere remains non-permit. O2, range 2.9 to 6.9 by depth. VOC unstable with intermittent high spikes. Ventilation underperforming due damage ducting. Possible nitrogen valve leakage. Recommending hard hold, mechanical repair on ventilation, and verified isolation test. The board operator came back after a pause. Copy all. Logging as active hazard assessment night. That single phrase mattered. Active hazard assessment meant the timeline now lived in two systems, local argument and central record. One could be pressured, the other persisted. She turned back to Luis and gave him the explanation she wished every junior mechanic got before their first turnaround. People think confined space incidents are dramatic. Most are quiet. You feel wind from a duct and assume safety. You smell less solvent and assume progress. Then oxygen stays low, decision pressure rises, and somebody treats numbers like attitude. Don't ever confuse ventilation noise with validated atmosphere. Luis nodded again, this time firmer. I'm not going in there like this, Trent barked from behind them. You don't decide that. Janet answered without looking over her shoulder. The atmosphere decides. A gust pushed solvent odor across the deck in a sweet, sharp ribbon, stronger than before. Then it thinned. Janet traced wind direction by the steam plume from a nearby vent and saw that the temporary exhaust hose from a small recovery sump had shifted 2 feet, now blowing cross-current toward the vessel work zone instead of away from it. Not a dramatic release, not a collapse, but enough to complicate local readings and worker exposure over a full shift. She directed a utility operator to reposition and clamp it. He did it immediately. She logged the adjustment with time. Small alignment errors compounded in industrial systems. Disciplined corrections were how disasters got prevented before they acquired names. She re-ran the profile after the hose reposition and duct kink reduction, because one set of numbers without retest was opinion in a hard hat. Top came in at 7.4, then drifted down. Mid held at 4.6. Bottom remained 3.1. Better only at the lip, still lethal at work level. VOC spikes reduced in amplitude but persisted. LEL still flickered. She looked at the monitor, then at the cracked baffle weld in her mirror, then at the oxygen cylinders on the tagged cart, then at the cold nitrogen line with bubbles still clinging at the gland. 4 separate indicators, one conclusion. The system was not stable, not mixed, not isolated, and not fit for entry. Janet stood, rolled her shoulders once, and read the declaration exactly as procedure required, so no one could later claim ambiguity. Confined space atmospheric conditions at digester vessel 4 are unsafe for entry. Permit is withheld, pending verified isolation, repaired ventilation integrity, and 3-point stable readings within acceptable limits. She handed Mina the notebook page with signatures from 2 witnesses and clipped a red "Do Not Enter" placard through the manway latch chain. The tag swung once in the rain and settled against steel with a soft tap. Around them, machines kept running, forklifts kept moving, radios kept crackling through ordinary tasks, and none of it changed. The only fact that mattered at that hatch: the sensor was red because the atmosphere was wrong. The tag swung once in the rain and settled against steel with a soft tap, and Trent Halverson stepped forward, yanked it off the latch chain, and held it up between 2 fingers like it was a parking ticket. "You don't get to red tag my unit," he said. His voice was low now, clipped and controlled in a way that carried farther than shouting. "You made your point. Put your name on the permit and move." Janet did not reach for the tag. She kept her monitor where he could see the red oxygen bar and the VOC trace still climbing and dipping in uneven teeth. "No," she said. "At 3.1 in the lower zone. No entrant survives a loss of consciousness window. That's mechanism, not opinion." Trent shook the tag once and dropped it onto her clipboard. "Your mechanism is delay. We are done with delay." She keyed her radio again and repeated the hold status to control, then added, "Supervisor attempting to remove posted entry prohibition without corrected atmosphere." The deck went quieter around them. Men still moved, tools still rang against steel, but nearby conversations thinned to single words. Trent turned half toward the crew and spread his arms in a performance of patience. "Everyone hearing this? We have active ventilation, we have open access, we have work scope approved, but we are stopped because one tech has decided she runs production Janet answered without raising her tone. You can run production after atmosphere recovery. Right now, we have oxygen deficiency plus vapor instability plus uncertain isolation. She walked to the nitrogen-blind flange, touched the cold pipe again, and held up her gloved fingers damp with leak check fluid. This line is still passing at the packing gland. You can hear it if you listen. Trent stepped beside her, leaned in, and waited 3 seconds. The hiss was faint under compressors and rain, but it was there. He straightened and said, "Minor seep, not flow." Janet nodded once. Minor seep into a confined shell is enough to hold oxygen down. Nitrogen does not need drama to kill. It only needs time and enclosure. Mina, still writing, looked between them and asked, "Do you want me to call maintenance for valve replacement?" Trent cut in. "No, not authorized." Janet answered, "Authorized under hazard correction. Make the call." At 5:55, she opened the laminated permit matrix clipped in her bag and held it flat against the vessel skirt so water would not bead over the print. She read aloud each trigger condition for a Class B confined space with prior inerting. Verified isolation at 0 energy. Forced air ventilation size to volume and obstruction. Oxygen between 19.5 and 23.5%. Flammables below 10% LEL. Toxicants below site limits. Continuous monitoring. Attendant and rescue readiness. We fail isolation verification, oxygen threshold, and stability requirement. Entry is prohibited. Trent gave a short laugh that made no pretense of humor. You reciting a card does not make you brave. Bravery is not relevant, she said. Sequence is relevant. He stepped in close enough that raindrops from his hard hat brim hit her face shield. Then sequence this. Sign permit now, or I log refusal and remove you from confined space authority for this turnaround. Janet felt her pulse in her jaw and forced herself to breathe once, steady and slow. You can remove me from task assignment. You cannot alter the threshold for breathable atmosphere. Louise shifted closer to Mina and whispered, "Not quiet enough." "Can they do that?" Janet answered him directly. "They can issue discipline. They cannot legalize deficient oxygen." Trent pointed at Louise. "You keep your mouth shut unless asked." Then back to Janet. "I gave you a direct order. You refused. Last chance." She said the same sentence again because consistency protected truth when reports were rewritten later. No permit, no entrant. She took her pen, wrote hold, atmosphere unsafe across the top line of the permit carbon set, and signed with time 5:56. Trent leaned over her shoulder, read it, and his expression hardened from anger into calculation. "Fine," he said. "If paperwork is your shield, I can do paperwork too." He pulled the permit book from his clipboard, flipped to a clean page, and began writing fast, pressing hard enough to dent through 3 copies. Mina stopped writing. "Supervisor, that requires atmospheric verifier signature." Trent did not look up. "I am the acting verifier." Janet moved her body to block the manway plane and put one hand on the latch chain, not touching him, not touching his forms, just occupying the legal boundary where entry started. "You are not certified as atmospheric verifier on this unit," she said. Trent signed anyway and tore off the top sheet. "Today I am." Janet keyed radio. "Control supervisor self-signing a confined space permit without qualified atmospheric verification. Please acknowledge." Static hissed longer this time. The board operator came back in a tighter voice. "Copy, Dawson. Escalating to shift superintendent." Trent heard it and jabbed a finger toward her radio. "Stop broadcasting internal disputes." "This is not a dispute," she said. "This is an unsafe permit action on a live turnaround." He took one step closer, then stopped when the monitor alarm chirped high again, and VOC flashed into warning yellow. Even he glanced at the screen that time. 3 days of revised schedules had already burned through the superintendent's patience, and everyone on that deck knew it. Trent used that pressure as a weapon because it usually worked. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "Corporate is on site in 2 hours. If DV4 is still idle, I answer for it. If I answer for it, I clean house. You first." Janet said. "Then answer with measured facts." He snapped back. "I answer with output." She pointed at the display, each value steady enough now to be undeniable. Output from a burn event shuts down longer than controlled delay. Oxygen enrichment plus solvent residue plus spark work creates flash risk in upper pockets. That is why confined space permits exist. He waved toward the blower. "We have ventilation. We have 600 cubic feet per minute through damaged ducting into a compartmentalized shell that needs 2,000 minimum with distribution. Ventilation noise is not atmosphere control." Trent looked at Luis, then at the other mechanics, hovering just outside earshot. "Any of you hearing her? This is why jobs run over." Fear dressed up as expertise. By 5:58, rainwater was running off the pipe rack in thin sheets, and the solvent odor came and went with each gust. Janet heard a radio squawk from a nearby operator reporting light vapor smell near the west fence line. Then another from utilities asking if the recovery sump hose move was complete. External signals were beginning to stack, each small by itself, each part of one system, drifting out of discipline. She logged the fence line odor call in her notebook without comment and returned to the immediate boundary at DV4. Trent saw her write and said, "What now? Building a case file?" "Building a record," she replied. "Records survive meetings." He gave her a flat smile. "So does unemployment." He raised his voice for the crew. "Janet Dawson is relieved from Confined Space Authority on this vessel effective now. Turn in your entry board and badge at shift end." No one answered him. Metal rain shields rattled overhead. The blower motor hummed with a strained bearing whine. Janet felt anger rise hot and immediate, then disciplined it into procedure. "State that order on radio," she said. "Include reason." Trent's eyes narrowed. "You don't get to script my management." "You already did," she said, tapping his unsigned meter field on the permit copy in his hand. "If you're removing a certified verifier during active hazard hold, it belongs in log traffic." He hesitated for half a second, then keyed his radio. "Control, this is Halverson. Reassigning DV4 atmospheric verification due to performance delay. Proceeding with alternate staffing." The board operator responded after a pause, long enough to communicate discomfort. "Copy. Reassigning noted." Janet keyed immediately. "Control, attach my objection. Atmosphere remains below minimum oxygen threshold with unstable VOC. I do not concur with entry authorization." "Copy objection," Control said. "Logged." Trent folded his radio back to his chest and pointed at Luis. "You, harness on. You are entrant." Luis did not move. "I'm scaffold crew. You are whatever I assign." Luis glanced at Janet, then at the vessel opening. "My monitor cert is observer level, not entrant." Trent said, "You'll be under my permit." Janet stepped toward Luis, keeping her voice level. Do not cross that plane without personal foregas, fit-tested respirator plan if required, and valid permit signed by qualified verifier. Trent cut in. Do not take instructions from relieved staff. Janet ignored him and addressed Luis by name. If oxygen drops under 19.5 at breathing zone, judgment goes first. You do not get warning time. Luis swallowed and nodded once. Trent barked. Enough. Mina, issue him Janet's meter. Mina clutched the meter case to her chest. I can't transfer a signed instrument without sign-off. Trent answered, This is sign-off. At 6 o'clock sharp, the shift change siren from the far boiler house gave one long note, and Janet felt the moment lock into memory with mechanical clarity. Wet concrete, red beacon pulse on steel, permit paper softening in rain, a supervisor pushing hierarchy against chemistry. She set her own monitor strap tighter around her wrist and said, My instrument remains with me. Chain of custody and calibration integrity. Trent pointed toward the gate. Then you're off this deck. She did not move. I remain as reporting witness under stop work objection. He took out his phone, dialed, and turned slightly away. Security to DV4, he said when someone answered. Need badge escort for a non-compliant technician. He ended the call and faced her again, triumph flickering at the corners of his mouth. You wanted formal. This is formal. A security card appeared 2 minutes later at the aisle break. Lights flashing amber, but no siren. Officer Keene stepped out, rain jacket over his uniform, and looked from Trent to Janet to the red beacon, reading the scene before he asked a single question. What's the status, he said. Trent replied first. Personnel removal. She's refusing supervisor direction. Janet spoke over him, calm and precise. Active confined space hazard hold. Oxygen-deficient atmosphere documented at top, middle, bottom. Supervisor has self-signed permit without qualified atmospheric verification and ordered replacement entrant. Keene exhaled once. I'm not trained to arbitrate permits. You don't have to, Janet said. You only need to note I'm not abandoning post voluntarily while unsafe entry is being initiated. Trent gestured sharply toward the access stairs. Escort her now. Keene hesitated, then said, Janet, if you refuse escort, this escalates. She nodded. Understood. I'll step to the outer tape and remain on radio. She walked 10 paces back to the painted boundary line, near the scaffold stack, never taking her eyes off the manway. Trent gave a satisfied nod as if he had won the argument by moving her boots. He had not moved the numbers. He turned to the crew and spoke fast. 5-minute purge, then Luis in for quick baffle grind. We are done babysitting this. Janet called out from the boundary, voice carrying clean through the rain. 5-minute purge does not equal atmospheric recovery in a 9,000 cubic foot compartmentalized vessel. Oxygen enrichment attempts are prohibited. Maintain hold. Trent ignored her and motioned to a pipe fitter at the oxygen cart. The man froze with his hand halfway to a regulator knob, glanced at Janet, then at Trent, and slowly pulled his hand back. Trent snapped. Did I stutter? The pipe fitter said, Need written instruction for oxygen tie-in. Trent glared, then scribbled on his clipboard and tore off a sheet. Janet watched that paper change hands and felt the core tension sharpen into certainty. Expertise had been formally displaced, but physics remained in command, and every second now was a countdown hidden inside ordinary motions. She keyed her radio one more time. Control, this is Dawson at outer tape. Supervisor has initiated alternate entry prep under objection. Request immediate superintendent presence at DV4. Control answered strained and quiet. Superintendent en route. ETA 4 minutes. Trent heard it and looked at his watch. Then at the hatch, then at Luis, calculating whether he could start before oversight arrived. He pointed at the harness rack. Move! Luis stood still for one breath too long, then reached for the straps with hands that did not look steady. Janet gripped her monitor until the casing creaked and held position in the rain. Removed from authority on paper, still the only person on that deck speaking in thresholds instead of deadlines. Trent pointed at the harness rack again and said, Move, Luis. We are already late. Luis pulled the webbing over his coveralls, clipped chest and leg straps with fingers that slipped once on wet buckles, and looked toward Janet as if she still held the final switch. Janet could not give him that switch anymore, not on paper. She raised her radio and said, Control entrant is being dressed under objection. Confirm Superintendent ETA. Static hissed over rain and blower noise. 2 to 3 minutes, Control replied. Trent answered the radio traffic without touching his own handset. We'll be done before that. The pipe fitter with Trent's handwritten instruction approached the oxygen cart and stopped beside the blower skid. He did not open anything yet. He waited, hoping for interruption from above that would let him set the wrench down with dignity. None came. Trent walked over, tapped the paper with 2 fingers and said, Crack both bottles into the blower intake manifold. Low flow. We just need oxygen up. Janet stepped to the edge of the boundary paint and raised her voice across the wet deck. Do not inject oxygen into a confined space purge stream with active solvent vapor. You will enrich the upper layers first. That is flash fuel behavior. Trent turned and gave her a thin smile. You're outside the tape, Janet. Stay outside the conversation. At 6:01, the pipe fitter opened one regulator quarter turn, then the second, just enough to lift the gauges. Hoses stiffened. A pale fog of condensed moisture feathered at a nicked ferrule before disappearing. The blower tone changed from a blunt hum to a sharper, thinner whine as intake composition shifted. Janet watched the duct line twitch against the manway flange, saw the taped tear pulse, and smelled the air change in a way only someone who had worked oxidizer systems could detect. Less damp metal heaviness, more dry bite in the back of the throat. She keyed the radio. Control unauthorized oxygen addition to purge stream confirmed at DV4. Log as critical deviation. Logged, came back from Control, voice clipped now. Superintendent 30 to 60 seconds. Trent had already moved to the permit board. He clipped his self-signed sheet in place, wrote Entry Start Prep 0601 in block letters, and handed Luis a personal gas monitor pulled from the gang charger. Janet leaned forward to see the calibration sticker from 10 feet away, expired by 12 days. She said it out loud so witnesses could hear. That monitor is out of calibration window. Do not issue. Mina, still near the board, flinched and checked the sticker herself. She's right, she said softly. Trent took the unit back, swore under his breath without volume, and thrust a different monitor into Luis's hand. Use this one. Clip center chest. You're going in for one weld tab, nothing else. Luis clipped it where instructed. The screen glowed green. O220.6 LEL0 VOC low, CO0, H2S 0. Janet closed her eyes for half a second and opened them again. Chest height ambient on an open deck meant nothing about a stratified dome. She called it anyway. External ambient readings are not entry readings. You need top, middle, bottom, internal confirmation after purge stabilization. Minimum 15-minute trend, not spot numbers. Trent answered by pointing at his watch. 5-minute purge is all we're giving this. The 5 minutes were theater measured with expensive equipment. The blower pushed a visible tremor through the duct and a draft across the hatch lip. But the vessel's interior baffles still broke circulation into pockets. Oxygen-rich stream came in high and washed the top geometry first. The lower zones, where inert gas sat heavy and trapped, lagged behind. Solvent film on corroded internals warmed under moving air and released in intermittent vapor ribbons that no one could see without an infrared camera. Janet knew the model by memory. When A happened, B built, then C failed. Inject oxidizer into a poorly mixed confined volume with residual fuel, and you did not fix oxygen. You redistributed risk into a narrower, hotter band. At 6:03, a gust carried odor toward the west fence line again. Control radioed, utilities reporting 2 neighborhood odor calls to main switchboard, environmental notified. That line should have stopped operations by itself. It did not. Trent only said, "Not my lane. Keep this moving." Janet logged the transmission with timestamp and looked toward Officer Keene, who stood by the security cart with his arms folded and face set in professional discomfort. "You heard that?" she asked. He nodded once. "I heard it." "Then note it," she said. He took out a small pad and wrote. Mina took attendant position by the manway with retrieval line over the tripod she had insisted on staging, despite Trent's impatience. That single insistence would matter in less than 2 minutes. Luis stepped to the opening, boots squeaking on wet steel, and looked into the dark interior where his lamp beam broke on baffle edges and returned in dull fragments. "How far to the tab?" he asked. Trent said, 8 feet in, then up left. Quick grind, clean patch, out. Janet called from the tape. "Luis, keep your monitor where you breathe. If it dips, you back out immediately, no debate." Trent snapped. "He takes direction from me." Luis did not answer either of them. He pulled his gloves tight, checked his tether, and placed one boot on the inner ladder rung. A minute later, the shift superintendent, Carla Nwosu, came around the aisle corner at a near jog, with rain shell open and helmet chin strap loose. One hand on her radio, she took in the scene in one sweep. Oxygen cart tied into blower, Janet at outer tape, Trent at permit board. Luis half entered. "Hold entry," she shouted. Trent shouted back, "Entry has commenced." Carla's expression hardened. "Then stop it and reset." Trent pointed at the monitor in Luis's chest. "He's reading safe oxygen now. We corrected it." Janet answered before Carla could respond. "You corrected a local number with oxygen injection into unmixed volume. Upper layer instability's likely worse now." Carla moved toward the manway, but Trent stepped into her path, just enough to slow her one stride. "Carla, if we halt again, this train misses startup window," she said. "If we don't halt, we may miss next quarter." He turned away from her and looked into the hatch. "Luis, continue." Luis dropped inside. 8 seconds after his boots crossed the plane of the manway, his monitor chirped once and displayed O2 19.8, then 20.2, then 19.9 at chest height as he descended the first section and leaned toward the baffle support. Mina called the numbers out because attendant protocol demanded verbal confirmation. Oxygen 19.8 to 20.2, LEL0, VOC 23 parts per million equivalent. Trent spread his hands as if the case was closed. Janet shook her head and spoke to Carla, fast and flat. Those are breathing zone spot values in a moving stream. We still have no top of dome sample after enrichment. Carla keyed her radio for portable probe support, but response lagged under overlapping traffic. The deck had become a layered soundscape. Rain, blower whine, distant forklift reverse alarms, crackle of radios stepping on each other, and the dull buzz of a grinder being checked at idle. Luis's helmet light moved in short arcs inside the vessel as he positioned himself near the corroded tab Janet had flagged earlier. He clipped his lanyard, tested footing, and said, "At work point, starting prep." "Stop and wait for top sample," Janet called. "Proceed," Trent said at the same instant. Luis hesitated. The hesitation lasted less than a breath, and then hierarchy won. "Proceeding," he said. At 6:04 and change, he touched the grinder wheel to metal for a test kiss, a brief chirp of contact that threw a few orange pinpricks downward and died. No event. Trent exhaled loudly, triumphant. "See? Fine." Janet stared at the manway lip, where warm air now breathed out in pulses, then at the fixed beacon which flickered red, reset, red again. She said to Carla, "We need him out now." Carla opened her mouth to call it. 45 seconds after entry, Luis shifted angle to reach the upper edge of the cracked baffle tab, raised the grinder to shoulder height, and made sustained contact. Sparks fanned upward this time, not down, because the wheel bit at a different orientation and the draft lifted the stream toward the dome. The first cue was not flame but light, a white flash front that snapped across the top interior like a camera strobe, turned violent, too bright and too clean to be ordinary hot work reflection. Then pressure hit. The manway cover chain went bar tight with a metallic gunshot sound. A slab of compressed air punched out of the opening and struck Trent, Carla, and Mina in the chest, hard enough to throw all three backward a half step. Janet felt it at the outer tape as a blunt slap against face shield and jacket. Her ears rang instantly. The blower duct jumped off alignment and whipped once like a live hose. For a fraction of a second, the opening became a white mouth with no depth. The white collapsed into orange. A rolling burn front curled out of the manway in a thick, fast tongue, wrapped along the vessel skirt, and licked up into nearby insulation jacketing. Not an endless movie explosion, not a towering fireball, but a compact industrial flash with enough heat to erase hesitation. Mina screamed, "Fire at opening, fire at opening," already pulling the retrieval line hand over hand. Carla hit her radio with a clipped command string. DV4 ignition event. Activate deluge. Dispatch fire team. Medical to process lane C now. Janet was moving before the second command finished. She ran from the boundary to the emergency pull station, smashed the manual deluge lever down, and felt the valve train shudder through the deck under her boots. 3 seconds later, overhead, nozzles opened with a hammering roar, water sheeting over the vessel shell and surrounding platform. Steam burst where spray met hot steel. She pivoted back, grabbed a dry chemical extinguisher from its bracket, and handed it to Keene, who had already pulled the pin. Inside the manway, Luis's radio was open but incoherent with coughing and clipped words. Mina kept hauling line with another operator now braced behind her. He's on it, keep tension," she shouted. Trent tried to surge toward the opening. Carla caught his sleeve and barked, "You stay out. No freelancing." Her face was wet with rain and deluge, expression stripped down to command geometry. Trent froze, breathing hard, Suit of authority gone in one pressure wave. 6 seconds of combined pull brought Luis to the ladder plane. 12 seconds brought his shoulders to the lip. Operators grabbed harness straps and dragged him onto the deck, then clear of runoff toward a drier patch by the scaffold stack. His outer coveralls were charred at one sleeve and shoulder. Helmet visor blackened. Gloves scorched. He was conscious, coughing, trying to speak, then curling around the pain in short, controlled sounds that made everyone around him move faster and quieter. Janet dropped to a knee at his side, checked airway and breathing, and said, "Luis, stay with me. Slow breaths. You're out. You're out." Medical arrived with burn kit and oxygen in what felt like 1 second and was closer to 2 minutes. They cut damaged fabric away from hot spots, applied sterile dressings, and loaded him onto a stretcher while continuing respiratory support. Janet stepped back only when ordered, hands shaking once now that the immediate extraction was complete. She watched the stretcher wheels rattle over expansion joints toward the ambulance bay, then heard the distant chop of rotor blades building through rain for the airlift transfer. Behind her, the vessel still hissed under deluge. Small insulation fires along a cable tray were knocked down by fire brigade in under a minute. A vapor haze hovered low before the water curtain drove it flat across the deck and away from personnel. Control radio traffic remained clipped and dense. Isolate feeds secure ignition sources, account for heads, initiate incident command. Janet looked at the permit board where Trent's handwriting bled in the rain. Entry start. Prep 0601 still legible, and beside it, Mina's earlier numbers from Janet's withheld sheet. Oxygen 3.1 at lower depth. 2 records on one clipboard. One had followed physics. One had challenged it. Carla turned to Janet, voice hoarse from shouting. "You have witness notes?" Janet held up the soaked notebook. Times, readings, odor calls, oxygen injection, permit objection, all of it. Carla nodded. "Protect that chain. Do not let it leave your possession until formal handoff." Janet slid the notebook into a sealed sample bag from the rescue kit and wrote her initials across the adhesive strip with a marker that barely worked in the wet. Trent stood a few feet away under deluge overspray, staring at the vessel with an expression that had no strategy left in it. He said to no one and everyone, "It was just one quick correction." Janet did not raise her voice. "There is no quick correction for chemistry you didn't measure." Fire brigade confirmed flame out. Utilities reported upstream feed isolated. Environmental requested immediate perimeter air sampling. Somewhere beyond the process lane, the helicopter descended through low cloud, and the whole site shifted from argument to consequence. The whole site shifted from argument to consequence. And Janet felt that change in the radios first. The channel that had carried one supervisor's orders a minute earlier was now a disciplined grid of commands, confirmations, and timestamps. Incident command active at process lane C. Accountability check in progress. Deluge flow verified. Medical transfer complete. She stepped under a pipe bridge to get out of the heaviest spray, pulled off her outer glove, and wrote the latest times on the outside of the evidence bag with a grease pencil. Ignition observed. Deluge pulled. Extraction complete. Ambulance departure. Airlift confirmation. Carla moved beside her, breathing hard but controlled, and said, "You and Mina come with me now. We locked the paperwork down first, then interviews." Janet nodded and kept walking. Boots slipping once on runoff as fire brigade finished sweeping foam along the cable tray supports. At 6:09, they reached the temporary command table by the maintenance office door, a folding surface that now held 3 radios, a site map, and an incident log binder open to fresh pages. Carla pointed to a clean plastic tote and said, "Chain of custody container. Put in everything you used for atmospheric verification." Janet placed her monitor, the sampling hose, calibration records, and notebook bag inside. Mina added the permit carbon copy she had been writing on when the readings were called. Carla slid Trent's self-signed permit in next, isolating it in a separate sleeve, and said to the scribe, "Mark this as disputed authorization, potential falsification, preserve ink bleed pattern." That level of detail would matter later, because wet paper often became an excuse for selective memory. Trent arrived at the table seconds later, jacket soaked, face gray with shock and anger fighting for space. "We need to restart utilities on that train before this spreads," he said. Carla did not raise her voice. "You are removed from operational authority pending investigation." He stared at her. "You can't sideline me in the middle of—" She cut in, flat and final. "I can, and I just did. Turn over your radio and permit book." He looked past her toward the vessel, as if he might recover control by proximity. Janet watched him choose badly again. This was a contained flash. We overreact and we lose the day. Carla answered. One critical burn, active fire response, unauthorized oxygen injection, and disputed permit sign-off. It's not a contained inconvenience. It is a recordable major incident. Officer Keene stepped into Trent's line of sight and extended a hand. "Radio, please." Trent held still for one beat, then unclipped the radio and set it down without another word. By 6:16, the first damage walk-down team staged at the hot zone boundary in flame-resistant gear with thermal imagers. They could not enter until fire brigade declared temperature stable, so they waited in a tight cluster while command ran the risk checklist out loud. Ignition sources isolated, line pressures reduced, structural checks pending, atmospheric retest at perimeter. Janet heard her own monitor data repeated over command channel and felt the odd split of disaster response, where her numbers were now institutional property, no longer part of an argument. She also heard environmental traffic continue to build. West fence line still reporting intermittent odor. Community Relations has 3 calls from Oak Ridge blocks. State Duty Officer request for callback acknowledged. The explosion had forced attention. The vapor release complaints gave regulators a second doorway into the same morning. The medical status arrived in clipped fragments. Luis was airborne at 6:18 with severe burns and smoke inhalation, conscious on transfer, respiratory support ongoing. 2 operators who had assisted extraction were in on-site treatment for inhalation and heat exposure, stable but removed from duty. A third worker from adjacent piping had mild respiratory symptoms after the burn front vented and was sent for evaluation as a precaution. No fatalities. Janet held that line in her head because it was the only merciful arithmetic available at that minute. No fatalities did not mean minor. It meant the tripod had been in place. Mina had held position and extraction started in seconds instead of minutes. At 6:24, command authorized the first interior visual from the manway using a pole camera rather than entry. The monitor feed showed scorched residue along the upper dome where the flash had traveled, blackening concentrated near baffled geometry, exactly where Janet had warned mixing would fail. The cracked support tab was now partially deformed. Insulation around the opening had burned back in an uneven ring. The temporary ventilation duct had collapsed near the taped tear and lay twisted against the skirt. Carla narrated findings for the log, while the maintenance engineer translated impact into repair scope. Replace damaged baffle section. Inspect full internal lining for heat stress. Hydro test cooling circuits. Recertify all nearby instrumentation. Re-terminate burned cable runs. Replace affected insulation jacketing, and perform full pre-startup safety review on the entire solvent recovery interface. Minimum outage? Carla asked. The engineer answered with professional caution. Best case 28 days if internals are intact. More likely 5 to 7 weeks with lining repairs. Janet heard Trent give a short, bitter laugh from the bench where Keene had asked him to remain. For one weld tab. No one responded. The plant controller arrived at 6:31 with a laptop and started building the first loss sheet as facts came in. Direct equipment damage, labor, contractor emergency mobilization, medevac, medical reserve, production loss by day, startup slip penalties, and probable claim exposure. Numbers climbed in real time with no dramatic music, just spreadsheet cells turning red. The controller read out a preliminary range to Carla. Direct physical and outage impact currently modeled between 7.9 and 9.4 million, depending on lining and instrument replacement. That excludes fines and litigation. Carla said, log midpoint at 8.6 for command brief, subject to revision. The scribe wrote $8.6 million preliminary in block letters. Insurance called before breakfast ended. A risk analyst on speakerphone asked for incident mechanism, permit status, and whether any process safeguards were bypassed. Carla kept the answer factual. Unauthorized oxygen added to purge stream. Permit signed by non-qualified verifier over documented objection. Potential isolation deficiency on nitrogen source. Ignition during hot work inside confined vessel. There was a pause. Then the analyst said, under policy exclusions, intentional bypass of written confined space protocol and unauthorized oxidizer manipulation may trigger denial on associated losses. Send full documentation immediately. Trent spoke from the bench without being invited. You can't deny for operational judgment during turnaround. The analyst replied, tone still neutral. Operational judgment is covered. Deliberate deviation from critical life safety controls generally is not. The line went quiet after that except for keyboard clicks, as the claim was flagged for special investigation. At 6:43, the shift superintendent made the required severe injury notification to federal safety authorities with Janet and the scribe listening for accuracy. Time of incident, employee status, injury type, location, and immediate controls were reported in one continuous statement. A case number came back, then instructions to preserve scene integrity and retain all digital records. Carla acknowledged each point and added voluntarily that permit irregularities were already identified. 5 minutes later, environmental compliance called the state hotline regarding fence line odor complaints and probable VOC release tied to isolation bypass. That report produced its own case number and a requirement for same-day perimeter sampling, plus follow-up emissions accounting. The delayed consequence that had started as smells strange outside the fence was now a formal enforcement track, with timestamps older than the flash itself. By 7:05, dawn had fully broken through thinning rain, and the deck around Digester Vessel 4 looked like a salvage zone instead of a work front. Burned insulation clung in damp strips. Foam pooled in low spots and carried black flecks toward trench drains blocked by absorbent socks. Fire brigade had posted a no-entry arc with rigid barricades, not tape, and tagged every potential evidence point. Oxygen manifold cart, regulator set, nicked hose ferrule, blower intake adapter, permit board, and nitrogen valve packing gland, where Janet had observed bubbling. She walked the perimeter with the incident photographer and called out what she had seen in sequence so image numbers matched mechanism, not just scenery. Photo this regulator position. Photo the handwritten oxygen tie-in order. Photo the expired sticker on first monitor that was issued then swapped. Each item got a placard number and a bag number. Physical evidence was no longer scattered around wet concrete. It was cataloged. Interviews began at 7:22 in the maintenance conference room, where fluorescent lights hummed too loud and everyone smelled faintly of smoke and deluge water. Janet gave her statement first because she had primary atmospheric data. She stayed with sequence, not adjectives. Initial O2 at 3.0%, stratified profile top middle bottom, unstable VOC, underperforming ventilation, suspected nitrogen seep, red tag posting, stop work call, supervisor override, reassignment attempt, oxygen injection order, entry under objection, ignition timing, rescue actions. When legal counsel asked, "Did you believe immediate death was possible at measured oxygen levels?" she answered, "At 3% oxygen in a confined space, loss of consciousness is rapid and rescue window is narrow. That is why entry was withheld." When asked whether oxygen injection could reasonably improve conditions, she said, "It can raise a local reading while increasing combustion potential in solvent conditions. Without validated mixing, it is a hazard multiplier." The court reporter read those lines back for confirmation, and Janet confirmed each word. Mina's statement matched Janet's on key points and filled in attendant actions. Keen's statement corroborated removal order, boundary position, and observed oxygen tie-in. Luis could not be interviewed yet, but his personal monitor was downloaded by instrumentation and produced a data trace that became the day's most unforgiving witness. Chest-level oxygen near nominal for brief intervals, then transient instability at the moment of sustained grinding, followed by signal disruption at ignition. Instrument logs from Janet's meter showed persistent deficiency and VOC variability in pre-entry sampling. The fixed beacon trend showed intermittent VOC pulses through the same window. Different devices, same story. At 8:10, Finance and Operations held a joint briefing in the command trailer, and Janet attended because Carla insisted technical causality be represented when costs were discussed. The production manager asked, "Can we isolate this to DV4 and restart adjacent recovery loops?" Engineering answered no. The flash damaged shared cable trays and triggered a mandatory integrity review across the solvent recovery unit. Restarting partial systems without full verification would violate both internal policy and regulator expectations now that incident reporting was active. The outage clock started there in formal terms. 41 days projected, contingent on inspection findings and regulator acceptance of corrective actions. Every day offline had a cost line. Every corrective action had a signature requirement. The plant had tried to save hours and had purchased weeks of shutdown. At 8:37, HR issued immediate administrative actions. Trent was suspended pending termination review, access restricted, and directed to surrender company devices for records preservation. 2 contractors involved in oxygen manifold setup were placed on non-disciplinary leave until interviews closed because command wanted facts before blame on assisting personnel under direct order pressure. Janet's removal from Confined Space Authority, logged by Trent over radio, was voided in writing and replaced with temporary assignment to incident review support. Back at the command table, Carla handed Janet the revised notice and said, "Your objection likely kept this from becoming a fatality count." Janet read the paper, folded it once, and put it in her pocket without comment. Vindication was not relief. It was simply accurate paperwork arriving late. The reputational impacts started landing before lunch. Community Relations forwarded 9 odor complaints and 2 social media posts from nearby residents describing chemical smell around sunrise and helicopter response shortly after. Corporate Communications drafted a controlled statement. Process incident contained. Injured personnel receiving care. No ongoing off-site hazard. Investigation underway with regulators notified. Environmental added a harder line for internal use. Because odor reports preceded ignition and aligned with bypassed recovery isolation, the state could assess penalties on emissions conduct independent of fire damage. One shortcut had split the liability path in 2, safety and environmental, and both paths had logs with names attached. By 9:15, Janet returned to the hot zone perimeter for one final verification task before she was released to debrief. The nitrogen line had been depressurized and mechanically isolated under witness. Packing gland rechecked with no bubbling. Ventilation ducting was removed and tagged out. Oxygen cylinders were capped, valves sealed, and cart impounded for evidence. She watched the tags go on and felt the morning resolve into a pattern she had seen too many times. First denial, then force, then incident, then paperwork that finally spoke in the same language she had used from the start. Physics had not punished anyone out of malice. It had simply enforced terms. Carla joined her at the barricade and read off the updated command summary for log closure of the acute phase. 1 critical injury airlifted, 3 secondary inhalation cases treated, active fire extinguished, unit stabilized, scene preserved, regulators notified, insurer notified with coverage reservation, preliminary direct and outage loss, $8.6 million. Projected shutdown, 41 days. She asked Janet for one final confirmation. "Do those numbers track with what you observed?" Janet looked through the barricade at the blackened manway lip, then at the permit board sealed in evidence plastic, Trent's ink still visible through water stains. "They track," she said. "And they will climb if anyone tries to call this an isolated spark instead of a control failure." Carla nodded once and relayed that exact sentence into the official log where it belonged. Carla nodded once and relayed that exact sentence into the official log where it belonged. Then she closed the binder, looked at Janet, and said, "Stay with me. We finish the chain before anyone starts rewriting motives." They walked back to the command table while rain thinned to mist and the smell of wet insulation gave way to sharp disinfectant from fire foam. The tote of collected items sat between 2 cones under a portable light. Carla read each evidence tag aloud and made Janet confirm condition and source before the scribe countersigned. Item A-01, Dawson 4 gas monitor, serial 7K19, active at incident. Janet nodded. "Mine, used for initial and profile readings." A 02 sampling pump and 30-foot tubing. "Mine." A 03 notebook and sealed bag with contemporaneous entries. Mine, initials intact. B-01 disputed permit set with supervisor signature. Seen and logged. B-02 handwritten oxygen tie-in order. Seen and logged. C-01 and C-02 oxygen regulators removed from manifold cart. From the cart staged at manway. D-01 nicked oxygen hose ferrule with visible frost mark residue. From same setup. E-01 blower intake adapter and taped duct tear segment. From purge line. F-01 nitrogen valve packing sample swab. From seat point I flagged. Nothing stayed vague. Nothing stayed, basically. By 9:42, every item was barcoded, photographed again dry, and transferred to locked storage with the custody receipt, printed and signed by both Shift Command and Compliance. Janet watched the tote leave in a cart with a tamper seal and felt the first clean line of the day settle into place. Physical evidence had moved from argument to record. At 10:08, the state environmental duty officer called back on speakerphone from the perimeter sampling van parked by the west fence. Preliminary PID readings elevated at 2 fence locations between 5:30 and 6:10. The officer said, "We are collecting canisters for lab speciation. Correlation to process upset appears likely." Carla asked, "Can you time correlate with complaint calls?" The officer answered, "Your switchboard logs show first neighborhood odor complaint before ignition. That matters." Janet wrote that sentence down, even though it was already being recorded. The delayed consequence had found its anchor. At 10:31, the federal safety investigator arrived in a gray rain shell, set a hard case on the table, and asked for the permit matrix, qualification roster, and radio logs before asking for opinions. He interviewed Janet in the same tone he used for valve serial numbers. "Did you communicate oxygen deficiency with measured value?" "Yes, 3.0 at hatch. Profile ranged 2.9 to 7.4 after adjustments, not stable." "Did you object on radio?" "Yes, logged by control." "Did supervisor possess atmospheric verifier certification for this unit?" "No." "Did oxygen get injected into purge stream?" "Yes, ordered and witnessed." He looked up once. That decision alone can move this to willful if corroborated. Mina and Keene corroborated it within the hour. Keene's loaded hesitation from the deck resolved in that interview room. He did not soften his statement to protect rank. "I was called for escort," he said, hands flat on the table. "I observed red beacon activity, heard hazard objection, and saw oxygen regulators opened after objection. I wrote notes at 6:03 on Ms. Dawson's request." He slid his pocket pad forward. The page showed rain-warped ink, still legible. Time, action, witness names. Another line clicked into place. At 11:17, the pipe fitter who had paused at the regulator gave his own statement and finished the sentence he had swallowed on deck. "I stopped because I knew it was wrong," he said, voice rough with embarrassment. "We were told to pre-stage oxygen bottles at 0450 by Trent in case readings stayed low." He said, "We are not losing a shift to a sensor tantrum. I should have refused the tie-in. I didn't." Compliance marked his role as cooperating witness under direct order pressure. He was not cleared, but he was heard. Trent's disciplinary hearing started at 1300 in Conference Room B, with security at the door and the windows fogged by leftover rain. Janet sat as technical witness, not accuser. HR read the allegations in order. Permit falsification, unauthorized reassignment of qualified verifier, unauthorized oxygen injection, override of stop work objection, records misclassification as insubordination delay. Trent tried schedule language first. We had turnaround pressure and active ventilation. I made a field judgment. Legal slid the downloaded monitor traces across the table. Your field judgment occurred after documented oxygen deficiency and after a written prohibition you removed. He switched to minimization. No one could predict that specific ignition pocket. Janet answered when asked, steady and brief. We predicted ignition mechanism explicitly. Oxidizer plus residual solvent plus grinding spark in an unmixed dome. At 13:47, HR ended it. Employment is terminated for gross safety misconduct effective immediately. Access is revoked. Device surrender is mandatory. Trent stared at the table, then at Janet, as if searching for negotiation in her face. She had none to offer. Physics had already closed that negotiation before sunrise. 3 days later, under clear sky and dry concrete, regulators returned for formal walkdown and sampling results. By then, the numbers were lab-confirmed. Elevated VOC species, consistent with solvent recovery vapor, had crossed reporting thresholds before ignition, tied to bypassed isolation. The environmental officer read the notice at the command trailer with witnesses present. Civil penalty assessment initiated for release and reporting deficiencies, separate from injury enforcement track. Carla signed a receipt. The plant controller, standing behind her with a tablet, whispered the figure when it posted. Janet heard him anyway. State piece alone is high six figures. No blast accompanied that loss. No siren marked it. It arrived through paperwork, exactly as she had warned on the wet deck. On the 7th day, insurance sent its coverage determination. The letter came by email and hard copy. Legal printed it and laid it flat beside the incident binder. Claim denied in substantial part under exclusions for deliberate bypass of life-critical confined space controls and unauthorized oxidizer introduction. Carla read it out loud once, then pushed the page to finance. The controller gave a humorless exhale. Saved maybe 4 hours. Bought $8.6 million and counting. At the hospital burn unit conference room, Janet met Luis for the first full conversation since extraction. He sat wrapped in light dressings, voice hoarse but steady, with respiratory therapist notes clipped to the foot of his bed. I heard you yelling to wait, he said. I heard both of you. I picked wrong. Janet shook her head. Hierarchy picked for you under pressure. You're alive because Mina staged retrieval and you stayed clipped. He held her gaze and asked the only question that mattered to him. Am I done in this trade? She answered with the same rigor she used at the hatch. You are in recovery first. After that, clearance decisions come from your doctors and rehab metrics, not shame. He nodded, eyes wet but focused. That scene ended without speeches, just two workers agreeing that survival was work too. 41 days after ignition, the solvent recovery unit sat ready for startup with new baffle steel, recertified instruments, replaced ducting standards, and a rewritten permit gate that required 2 independent verifier signatures whenever inerting had been used. In the pre-startup review room, the federal citation package was delivered in person. Willful violations, serious violations, and mandatory corrective actions were read point by point. The investigator added one line off script. Your internal objection record prevented a fatality classification. Keep that discipline. Carla acknowledged. Janet signed as Incident Review Board member. Her reinstatement letter and back pay confirmation were attached to the same packet. The criminal hearing took place in a county courtroom with beige walls, humming lights, and no appetite for drama. Trent stood at counsel table in a plain jacket, no clipboard, no audience. The prosecutor summarized the mechanism with clinical precision. Measured oxygen deficiency ignored, permit controls falsified, oxidizer injected into solvent environment, worker critically injured. Defense argued reduced counts, accepted responsibility language, no prior criminal history. The judge accepted a plea to reduce charges of reckless endangerment and records tampering, imposed probation, mandatory safety ethics training, and a binding prohibition on supervisory authority at any company facility. When the clerk read the supervisory disqualification into record, Janet felt the moral center of the file lock shut. Not revenge, constraint. After court, the company incident review board held final testimony in a windowless training room that smelled like dry erase ink and coffee gone bitter on a warmer. Janet stood at the front in clean PPE, not because the room required it, but because the role did. New supervisors sat in 2 rows, some defensive, some frightened, all suddenly attentive to thresholds they had treated as paperwork. She projected the timeline. 5:42 insult, 5:47 profile, 6:01 oxygen tie-in, 6:04 ignition, then losses in dollars, days, and enforcement lines. She did not ornament the lesson. She read her closing statement exactly as entered in the official record. Authority can threaten, budgets can squeeze, schedules can slip. None of those variables changes combustion limits or breathable atmosphere. Physics does not negotiate. No one argued, no one looked away. When the session ended, Carla handed Janet the final closure memo. Every external contact had an outcome attached. Federal case resolved with citations and abatement deadlines. State environmental case assessed and paid with corrective monitoring. Insurance claim denial logged and reserved in financial statements. Neighborhood complaints answered with documented sampling and mitigation notice. Every collected item had disposition recorded. Monitors archived after data export. Permits retained in legal hold. Oxygen hardware condemned and destroyed after evidentiary release. Nitrogen valve rebuilt and tested. Duct segment kept for training exhibit. Notebook returned to Janet with certified copies in the file. Loaded looks had become signed statements or were marked as non-responsive where witnesses declined follow-up. Strange details were no longer strange. They were findings. Janet left the building into late afternoon light that made the pipe racks look almost clean from a distance. They were not clean. They were corrected. She paused at the edge of process lane C, looked once at digester vessel 4 behind fresh paint and new tags, and kept walking toward the gate with her hard hat under her arm and her badge clipped back where it belonged.